Welcome to an ethics roundtable on ethical considerations in HR and organizational practices. For those of you that don't know, I am Tracy Gonzalez-Padron, the director of the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative Collegiate Program at UCCS College of Business. Ethics roundtables provide UCCS faculty and staff, along with invited students from schools all over Colorado and Wyoming, to hear from our UCCS ethics fellows on innovative approaches to teach ethics and implement principle-based ethics in their work or area of expertise. It is my pleasure to introduce Todd Endres. Todd is an instructor of management and human resources. Go ahead, Todd.
Okay. Hey, good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining on this snowy day. Usually, I have to allot some extra credit points to get attendance like this, and so I appreciate everybody joining. It's flattering. As Tracy mentioned earlier, my hope and intent is for this morning to be relatively interactive. I want to get a couple of things. We're going to take a couple of really short case studies for a ride. I want to get your perspective and view of how you might approach things, but also since really, as I've mentioned before, this is a prologue into a new course that I'm actually delivering this semester. So I'm interested in your feedback as well as we progress. So please, by all means, unmute either audio or video. I'd love to get your interaction, and I think it'll be a good conversation. When I had the opportunity, when Tracy said, "Todd, it's your turn on deck," from a presentation standpoint, I thought that was fantastic, and I started to build it around, the course presentation or the course proposal I had, which originally was going to be entitled Shades of Gray, but the title "It Depends" is actually a nod to my students. Over the course of the last couple of semesters, as I teach primarily organizational behavior and HR related classes, as we've gone through different dialogues, somehow the notion of "it depends" has gained traction with my students. So whenever I ask a question of the group, typically they've all been conditioned now where the answer is, of course, it depends. So I want to spend a little bit of time this morning just going through my course content, as well as, like I said, give an opportunity maybe for you guys to stretch your thinking a little bit as well. I think it's always good to have a baseline understanding kind of the lens in which that people look at things through, and a little bit about the background and context. I joined the university in 2020, actually teaching is my second career. My first career, I spent 27 years as an HR practitioner, supporting a variety of organizations in a variety of industries: healthcare, technology, information services. And I was blessed with the opportunity to lead several HR organizations, from as small organizations as 500 to the largest was 30,000, where I was responsible. I was the head of HR and organizational effectiveness for the global operation of a company by the name of LexisNexis. Some of you may have heard of Lexis from a research perspective. And so I look at things through the lens of a practitioner, and I'm now trying to apply that and provide a bit of an insight or a view, if you will, as we work with students developing kind of our leaders of the future. When I joined the organization, one of the challenges or opportunities that I was given was to work with Dr. Milliman to look at our HR curriculum from a refresh standpoint, to make sure that that we are up to date and contemporary. And so over the course of, I believe, the back end, John, of 2020, first part of 2021, we stepped back and looked at all the curriculum with basically a lens of saying, what are the skills and competencies that we need to use or provide our students as they go out into the workplace. And so through that, we made shifts in curriculum. We added some things here, deleted some things here. But one of the areas that we wanted to focus on that I said, well, one of the gaps that we have as I stepped back and looked at things through the lens of an HR leader is what were the things that I found as I was hiring new HR people into the industry or as people were joining from academia right out of school. What were the key things that maybe they were listening or they were missing that we were spending a lot of time from a developmental perspective? And so we started to develop this course, HR 4450, which we've affectionately referred to as advanced topics in HR. And I'll describe that in just a little bit. One of the things is we were looking at from a leadership development standpoint and from a practitioner's perspective, one of the things I think we do a great job at, particularly as a result of our work with the Daniels Fund, as well as some of our other professional organizations, is I think we've done a great job or do a very good job of providing people with a lens and a firm set of principles from a professional standpoint. So we have the Daniels Fund principles, which I think we can all stack hands on us that are fantastic and provide, a reasonable set of true north principles. But then also for our aspiring or current HR practitioners, we have certain code of ethics that we have professionally as well through the Society of Human Resources, as well as a couple of the other certifying bodies. And both of them provide excellent foundation, an excellent lens by which to look at the world through. But one of the challenges I found is that while that provides or has provided a good sense of the what, one of the challenges I found with students is trying to provide a view and help develop the mindset about the how. So how do we take the lens? How do we understand those ethical foundations and principles? But really, from a professional standpoint, what is it that we're doing to prepare people to put those into practice? Now, while we've got a firm set of principles, one of the challenges we have, certainly from in the world of HR, is we operate in an uncertain environment. Truly, as an HR practitioner, we operate more times than not in a shade of gray. There are few, if ever, clear-cut answers. And typically the answer is it depends. And part of the reason for that from an HR perspective, much like a senior leadership perspective, is that you have a view and you're influenced by a whole host of issues. You're having to factor in things associated with legal and regulatory requirements. What's happening in the world around us? What are the social impacts? Are there policies within the organization that are guiding decisions? What are the cultural implications on an organization based upon some of the decisions that we make and the recommendations and things that we may be delivering from an HR perspective? And then wrapping that around too is that we need to make sure that we're keeping the human and human resources, both in terms of what the people impact are, the decisions and activities that we may be implementing, but also, quite frankly, as an individual practitioner, you're having to contemplate and incorporate what are those areas and the lens and biases that you're bringing to the table as well. And so part of this issue then, as we started to build the curriculum, is to look at and say, let's try to find a perspective by which we're providing students a contemporary view into industry and to some of the challenges and opportunities that exist specifically to the HR domain. Now, this class is primarily targeted to senior level, late junior through senior level students, many or most of which have an HR emphasis. And so our goal, the mission of the group is how do we take and make sure that those folks have a perspective and a lens in terms of what's happening in the world around them now, because we've built a foundation in our other coursework in the past. So what's happening in industry at the moment, and then to get them thinking proactively about how then can they start to apply the knowledge we've given them in some of our baseline classes, but also operate from a personal, ethical, and principle-based approach. The course itself is run much more like a seminar than it is certainly any type of lecture environment. We spend probably 20% of our time on content, and the rest of the course, quite frankly, is based clearly and solely on things like discussion, debate, and application. And I'm fortunate and privileged that at least this semester, I have several students that have been with me in the past, and there is no, let's just put it this way, there is no shyness amongst the group. And so it is a very real world spirited debate sometimes. But I found that through that process, that approach of discovery has done a fantastic job of opening up some of the eyes and ahas that they brought to the table. And so, it's very Socratic in nature, it's very applied in nature, and it is largely case-based. And we're going to try just a couple of those cases on with you guys here momentarily. And so I'm hoping that that you'll chime in either live or via chat to provide your perspective. So that's a general overview of the course. So we're taking, how do we take contemporary HR practices and issues, and then layer on top of that a degree of an ethical lens or a principle-based application. Just to give you a sense, as we've built the curriculum, these are some of the core topics that we've talked about. So as I've mentioned, looking at what are the current trends in HR, so things like the use of technology and artificial intelligence and those types of things. We're trying to beef up the level of impact and capabilities from a consultant standpoint, which is really the role that an impact HR player tends to have if they're able to effectively develop the right types of relationships and credibility in the organization, but also looking at things like making sure that our students have a baseline, particularly HR students have a baseline of how do they apply business principles to their HR practices. Last night we were talking about, so the class has been conditioned to, the typical answer is, what do you do here? And to what they typically respond, it depends, which they get an A for, and we process that. And then the next thing that we work on is the so that. So we work on it depends, we do the diagnostic, and then I always encourage them from a business lens to, in their recommendations, they make the leap to so that it has this impact on the end customer. Because I've always said that good HR people are really good business people first, who have a domain expertise in HR. And so that's part of the lens that we're trying to develop for them to be able to establish the greatest level of input and impact. So we look at things like business acumen, spend a good deal of time. We're going to be looking at infrastructure and technology. As I mentioned before, the proliferation of the use of things like artificial intelligence in HR, as well as virtual reality and some of those types of applications. And then getting into how do you navigate some of the tougher challenges associated with conflict management, some of the issues that when we do run into an ethical conundrum, how can they best address that while maximizing the organization's effectiveness, but also looking at, I've always said that HR is the custodian of the heart of the organization. And so, part of that is how do we balance business practices with the culture, climate, and needs of the organization. So here's Chris. This is now all of the case studies, typically good or bad, unfortunately, are a function of, these are real cases that, quite frankly, are situations that I have personally experienced in my past. And so usually I will have the rest of the story. So let's start with one. I'm interested in your perspective. This is Chris. Chris is actually one of our students. So this is a real-time case study. Chris is a full-time UCCS student taking a full load of 5 courses. He's married and works part-time as a cook in a chain restaurant here in Colorado Springs. Chris's boss, Lauren, intercepted Chris one night leaving the building with a styrofoam container of a cheeseburger and French fries. The company has a policy that any food taken from the restaurant needs to be paid for, albeit at a discount. And when approached, Chris said, well, this is this is a cheeseburger. This is a meal that was returned to us from a client because it wasn't prepared to their satisfaction, which ordinarily would be thrown out. Oh, thanks, Tracy. So you have an individual who, in this situation, has clearly violated the policy of the organization. Now, Lauren has gone to you as the HR practitioner and said, I've got a problem with Chris. I caught him stealing. We need to fire him this afternoon. I'd like to call him in right now. So based on just that information, do you proceed with the termination? Yes or no?
No.
Steve?
I say no, because there needs to be there's usually policies in place for like first-time offenders, second, and so on. And you know, there's no real reason for him to be terminated.
Okay, well, in this situation, so I'm just going to play this out. So in this situation, there is no first, second, or third offender policy. It's if you steal something, you get fired. And Lauren, in this case, has deemed the cheeseburger and French fries as theft. So we got a bunch of no's. All right, too extreme. Others?
I would say no, with the caveat, complimenting kind of your introduction about what are some of the critical skills that some of these future practitioners need to have, which is patience. It sounds like there are specific details that have been provided from one perspective, but you're in the leadership HR compliance role. No one's going to jail tomorrow. I would apply a little bit of tactical patience and allow some more feedback to come in. Perhaps maybe his past work experience, his past performance, a variety of other things, but I certainly wouldn't move at the speed with which you described.
Okay, so I'm just going to pick on people. So Anthony, I hear you. I'm Lauren now. Anthony, that's a great perspective, but he stole from us and I want to fire him, and I called him in today at 2. Now what? So appreciate your input, but I want to fire him.
So for context, are you the hiring and firing authority?
I am. I'm the restaurant manager.
Then as a ethics and compliance professional, I will do my best to provide you with advice. But ultimately, if you have that authority, that's your call.
Okay, fair enough. So Shannon says stealing food and intercepting something on the way to trash are 2 different things. Shannon, in this situation, in this restaurant, they are deemed the same. All food, that's the other policy, any food returned needs to be thrown away. So now he's violated 2 policies.
Hi, this is Helen. So is that written in the policy, you say, specifically in the policy?
Yeah, specifically the policy says any returned food needs to be thrown in the trash. The second policy is all employees need to pay for any food that they consume from the restaurant. Okay,
Yeah, that's a
Shannon
tough
says,
one.
oh, okay, she changes, then yes.
Yeah, that's tough.
Okay. All right. Now you've brought in Chris to have what is likely to be a very difficult conversation because it's going to result in his termination. And in talking to Chris says, well, hang on a second, maybe it'd be good if you understood the context. And Chris begins to disclose to you that yes, he's a full-time student. He's married. His wife is unemployed because of COVID, and he's working this job schlepping burgers at the restaurant. And quite frankly, the only thing that he and his wife have survived on for the last 3 days has been ramen noodles. And he says, specifically, quote, a man's got to eat. So does that change the context at all or the response?
Casey here. That doesn't change my response or context necessarily, but I am in line with Anthony of saying we gotta know all the facts as well as having some patience here. review the policy with them again and say, if it happens again, you're gone.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. So we can keep playing this out, and that's typically what I will do in class, right? And so, as the manager, I would continue, Anthony, to press you on, maybe you didn't understand where I was going, Anthony, but we're going to fire him, right? And so from a student perspective, I do try to take a very real world application. The point of this story is Lauren then was convinced that Lauren changes her perspective based upon just some additional information. And it's simply, quite frankly, it adds some compassion into the practice. So can I fire Chris? Yeah, I sure can. Legally, can I fire Chris? Yes. By policy, can I fire Chris? Certainly. But is that who we want to be as an organization? So it's when you start to layer on those types of things is where, as an HR person, you start to deal with kind of the ethical foundation and overlaying a degree of principles into the application of things like policy, practices, laws, et cetera, et cetera. So the whole point in like a Chris story is there's usually, and I think Anthony, you mentioned it, I can't remember if it was you or Casey or somebody else said, you know what, I exercise a little bit of patience. And the reason you look for that patience is because you're always trying to find out what the rest of the story is. Because at the end of the day, these decisions oftentimes, again, don't come down to the policy, they don't come down to the law, they don't come down to what the boss says. Oftentimes it comes down to the contextual types of elements. Because at the end of the day, it depends.
Can I pile on just one little kind of book into that?
Sure.
That patience not only supports that employee, and it's interesting you use it depends, because as an inspector general, that has saved many an IG's career, because they will apply the it depends feedback. But you're also taking care of the employer, because it is a very slippery slope with reprisal, retaliation. And if you take actions, not only could you put at risk the employee's situation, but you could put the actual business at risk if you rush to failure.
Yeah, good point. Let me ask the group, I'd be interested in your perspective. Does everybody need to be treated the same? Somewhat rhetorical. Okay. Sandra says no. But the question is, do they need to be treated the same? No, probably not. But do they need to be treated? Thank you, Helen. It does depend. They need to be treated equitably, right? So I would have, from a practitioner standpoint, I would have individuals, I would have managers sometimes say, well, what's our precedent on this? Well, we did this in this situation, and I would say that's fantastic, but this isn't a precedential decision, because certainly if I had that exact same situation, I should treat it the same. But if the context is different, Anthony, back to your point, if the context is different, if the facts change a bit, then you are in that element and that shade of gray that sometimes becomes really significant and is what begins to kind of muddy the waters a bit. So that's an example, just a little bit of the type of discussion and kind of ride we go on through through our class design. One of the things from a content perspective in all of my classes, and this is just my personal bias, I spend a lot of time with students in just about all of my classes working on the issue of emotional intelligence. My experience has been that, quite frankly, emotional intelligence is the make or break for individuals in their career over time. So we spend a good deal of time talking about developing self-awareness, understanding where you're at in the moment. If you're an HR practitioner and Lauren's in front of you and kind of leaning into your desk and being a bit aggressive, how are you responding as the HR person? Okay, as an example. And then the social awareness component of, am I able to read the reactions, the room, and be able to shift kind of my perspective, my approach, and my behaviors accordingly. So just real simply, we build on, particularly in my HR classes, a huge emphasis on the need for HR professionals specifically to develop a strong sense or strong competencies in emotional intelligence. So that's our baseline. But we said then now, how do you take, when I go back to my previous slide about the foundation where we've got our Daniels principles, we've got things like our professional principles through things like SHRM. How do I take those now in the context of an organization and apply that? And it's timely because I just started to lay this specific foundation with my course last night. So I start to develop a framework or a lens by which to have them look at through. I'm a big believer in threes. So self-awareness, social awareness, regulation, strategy, structure, and people. In this case, it's consciousness, competence, and courage are the three primary levers that, in my opinion, I try to reinforce with HR professionals and certainly with my students in terms of how do I take those core principles now and put them into play. So some of you may have heard of the lesson or the issue of boiling the frog. Okay, for those of you who haven't, boiling the frog is a bit of an analogy where if I were to take a frog and throw them into a hot boiling pot of water, what typically are they going to do? They're going to jump, right? They touch the water, it's hot, and they're going to jump out. But you're really hungry, and you're hungry for frog legs tonight. If you take that same frog, put them in a pot of cold water, slowly ratchet up the heat, soon the water boils, and shortly thereafter, you're having a meal of frog legs, as an example. So one of the challenges that I have, and I try to work with students on, is being mindful of where are they at and what's going on in the world around them. Because one of the challenges I've found for professionals is the issue of kind of the frog in the water, or what I refer to as incrementalism. One of the challenges that I find, particularly from an HR perspective, is sometimes you find yourself in a pot of hot water that you didn't know was boiling. Because there's issues that arise when we said that kind of situations start to unfold. Eventually what may happen is you as an HR leader may end up on, I use the analogy, the front page of the newspaper with my students the other day, and they looked at me like I had 3 eyeballs because they said, what's a newspaper? But in the past, so it's you end up front and center as the HR person in an organization when you get into type of an ethical, public relations, or other types of issues that, quite frankly, had you known what's going on at that moment in time, it would have been hot enough that you would have jumped out. But the challenge we have in the real world of organizational life is those things don't happen. They're easy when you're fortunate enough to have a conundrum like this that is really clear cut. You know how to jump out of the water. But it's the challenge of being mindful of, what's the progression in the organization so that ultimately you don't find yourself boiling in the hot pot. But it's also being conscious of what lens or what biases do you bring. And always, as I tell my students, you got to check yourself before you wreck yourself. So understanding, what is it based on? That can be based on your previous experience with a particular leader or a particular employee, where you've developed a certain perception, lens, or bias, positively, negatively, or whatever, for that particular individual. And so again, checking yourself, being mindful of where you're at, checking yourself in terms of kind of the lens by which you're looking at things through, and always being mindful of that is the self-awareness piece. And then the last piece is being aware of the diffusion of what I call the diffusion of responsibility. Sometimes from an HR perspective, you get lured into a false sense of security because you're part of a bigger system, or you're delivering perhaps on a service or directive that somebody has given you. Okay, so it's part of it is, there's safety in numbers, and there's also anonymity. So recognizing the fact that as an HR person individual, just like a CEO of many organizations, you are one person who's stand and held to account. And so understanding and recognizing kind of that degree of responsibility and accountability that you may have. Okay, second case study. This is a real world case study that I experienced 10 or 15 years ago. This is Mark and Alec. I have changed the names to protect the innocent or the stupid, whichever. Mark is a young professional. I inherited Mark when he was a supervisor in the organization, was just getting promoted to manager. Really bright guy, excellent leader, had tons of raw potential. And over time, I worked with Mark as he ran into various types of issues. And I became a bit of a champion of his as he progressed through the organization. And he did a fantastic job. When we would do talent reviews, he was typically on the top of the chart, identified as a potential employee. Over the course of 7 years, he had risen substantially through the organization. And one of the things, I was part of a large multinational organization, global organization at the time, and we did a lot of work around talent development. One of the things that we would do is we would put people on what we called a stretch assignment, okay? Give them an opportunity as maybe an emerging leader to take over a bigger operation, to work outside of their domain expertise and that sort of thing. Mark was fantastic. You want him as part of the organization. The opportunity we had was we had a position overseeing some of our European operations. And we said, this would be a wonderful opportunity to give Mark a stretch assignment. So Alex and the leadership team stacked hands. We sent Mark to London to begin running those operations. One of the things about our organization at that time, somebody once said, we never met a reorg we didn't like. Okay, so we operated in a degree of instability. So fast forward about 6 months, I'm in Alec's office. Alec is a Scotsman with a strong accent, which I wish I could try to replicate, but I can't. At least not to preserve any type of sense of self-worth. And Alex says to me, he says, Todd, Mark's having problems. I think we need to take him out. Performance is down. He's just not making the progress that we've wanted, and we need to turn that operation around. And I think it's time to pull him out. So as an HR person, what's your response? Do you go ahead and pull him out? He's underperforming. Anybody?
It depends. We need some more information.
That's the virtual high five, Steve. Okay, so here's how the conversation unfolded. I said, Alec, that's great. I said, and we can certainly do that. I said, but we put Mark in this as a stretch assignment, right? And he said, I wish I could do the accent, guys, because it would just make this story so much richer. I said, this was a stretch assignment, right? And he said, yeah, it was. And I said, okay, so the stretch was to give him the opportunity to grow, correct? Yep. And we moved him and his family in an expat assignment to London, right? Yep. I said, okay, so we put Mark's taken the risk. So as a stretch assignment, Alec, I said, what have we done to make Mark successful? Have you spent time with him? Have you provided him the feedback? One of my personal principles as an HR leader is the worst thing I have to do is if I have to separate somebody from the organization. And certainly if it's a performance situation, that should never be a surprise. So I asked Alex, I said, what have you done? And he said, well, I really have. I said, have you met with him? Well, no, not really. I said, okay, so in this situation, it's a stretch assignment, but who's stretching? If that rubber band in his stretch snaps, he's the only one that gets snapped by it. So from an ethical or principle-based standpoint, have you done what you need to do? Have you fulfilled your end of the bargain? That to which, fortunately, thank goodness, he said, yeah, you know what, you're right. I do have an obligation to lean more forward into this. And we continued the conversation because I also said, Alec, put it through this lens. I said, is that who we are as an organization? Culturally, is that who we want to be and hold ourselves up to? And so that was just a situation or scenario where you get placed in, if he wanted to move forward, that is a situation where I would have fallen on the sword and said, I cannot support that decision, and would have certainly escalated to the CEO. So these situations they're not black and white, right? You're all operating in the shade of gray. And so how do you ask, one of the great things here, Robin said, you need to get more information. Janet says, wouldn't you want proof, etc. And that's absolutely the point. Is the thing that I'm trying to work with students on is two things. One is, are you asking the right questions and getting the right information, and then understanding the foundation and the principles by which you're going to make a decision or recommendation. Because in HR, while we may not make life and death decisions, we do for sure make life decisions. Because when we do things with employees, we're impacting their income, their families, their health, their well-being. So we have to make sure we are not taking those decisions lightly. We have an obligation professionally, personally, and ethically. We talked about consciousness. The second piece that I talk to the students who are working on is the issue of competence. And by competence is maintaining a degree of professional mastery. Are you staying up to date with current trends, current issues, current technologies, and that sort of thing? And understanding the world around you. When I say environmental awareness, I'm not necessarily talking about natural environmental awareness. I'm really talking about just the world around us. And so things like, I tell my students, the tectonic plates by which we built organizations are shifting so dramatically that organizations are having a hard time they're having a hard time adjusting policies and practices. And certainly the legal system is going to lag behind some of the many challenges we have by several years. But with that, we have to deal with issues such as is associated with privacy and privacy in a home-based office. What are the issues associated with the advancements of big data and social media? And how does social media impact an individual's work experience? Okay, the use of artificial intelligence in selection and screening. So maintaining some degree of awareness and understanding from a professional standpoint is critical. The last thing that I talk about, this is an important one, is I also talk about the fitness to practice. So while we may not make life and death decisions, we are making important decisions. And so if I'm approached to make a decision perhaps on somebody's long-term employment, or maybe a decision associated with a compensation issue, or whatever it may be, an organizational issue, and if I am not in the right mental frame of mind, if I'm burned out, if I'm upset, if quite frankly, I don't feel I'm in the right headspace, should I be involved in making that type of decision? Or do I need to check myself back out to make sure that I'm in the kind of fitness to practice type of perspective? Sandra, that is a fantastic, she says, it also means having a fearless HR practitioner. What a wonderful segue to the last piece of it, which is courage. So I don't know if any of you have followed the Theranos study or situation. Theranos is a medical device company that was started by Stanford dropout Elizabeth Holmes. Some of you may have seen her on the front page of the quote unquote newspaper, who has just tried in the courts for some of her business practice associated with the representation of the product efficacy as it related to its ability to deliver, and did it defraud shareholders, etc. Elizabeth Holmes became the youngest female billionaire in history. She modeled herself, as you can tell by the black turtlenecks, after Steve Jobs. At the end of the day, though, the organization was built on some pretty shady practices. Now you enter in two young 22-year-old Stanford college graduates. They're 22 years old. Oh, let me back up. Theranos is medical technology. The intent was, they call it the Edison box, was to take a pinprick of blood and be able to run 200 plus tests at any given time. The plan was to partner with Walgreens, et cetera, and put kind of medicine in the hands of the consumer. There was only one problem with the Edison machine, because it didn't work. In fact, it was a big black box. And if you opened up the box, there really wasn't anything in it. When they were testing it, figuratively speaking, there were like 3 or 4 hands on the other end of the box pulling the tests out and running them on different machines. Okay. So you have these 2 college students, 22 years old, looking at data and starting to scratch their head and say, this isn't exactly making sense. The tests and the data don't support what we are representing to the marketplace. So they approach their supervisor. This is not an HR story, but it's really a lesson in courage. They approach their supervisor and say, something's not right with the numbers, to which the supervisor says, okay, you know what, we'll go eliminate the outliers and see what the results are, which from a statistical standpoint is questionable. So they go back and they begin to look at that, and they're still not feeling right. They ultimately escalate up to Elizabeth Holmes, who says to them, for all intents and purposes, hey, we got this, shut up color and go back to work. Tyler Schultz, the gentleman you see on the screen, is also the grandson of George Schultz, the former Secretary of State for the US. He's also a board member for Theranos, and in a family get-together, I believe, they both approached him and said, there are issues with our product. To which, unfortunately, he responded, hey, we've got this. That's okay. Go back to work. And ultimately, they had to make the decision that they both left the organization. Fortunately, they were contacted by a reporter from the Wall Street Journal, who then started to break the story. But in the process of that, Theranos began to actively pursue the 2 of them legally, to the point that Tyler's parents were on the verge. He was asking them to sell their home in order to fund his legal bills. So the price was high. So one of the things that I challenge the students in class to say, you know what, it's fantastic for us to talk about ethical principles and our Daniels principles and maybe the principles associated with our professional practice. But at the end of the day, it comes down to these 3 questions. Is making sure that they are personally understand where's their personal line in the sand that they're not willing to cross, or what's their walkaway point. For example, with Tyler and Erica, where's the point for you professionally as an HR professional that you say, I need to cash out and walk out because this situation is not consistent with who I am personally or professionally? And then what are you willing to risk? And so one of the things I find students will say is that, oh, well, you know what, I would walk away here, or I have these strong, my ethical foundation is based upon this. And I say, that's fantastic. I said, now fast forward 2 years in your career, you're married, you have 2 kids, a mortgage, and 2 car payments.
What?
Does that change your line in the sand?
Hello?
And so part of it is going through that iterative process to help them through the journey of self-discovery, to understand, what does it mean, as Sandra says, to become a fearless
Okay, I'm
HR
sorry. I don't know
practitioner.
that. Thank you.
So look for April Daniels. Oh, Tyler, good. If you have a chance, I would go on to YouTube. There's some fascinating work there with Tyler and Erica Chung. If you want to use them with your students, I think they are 2 really excellent models for our students without understanding the totality of the picture. But the point of this is that 3rd one. So we have consciousness, competence, and then this last one of courage, which is really the wraparound. And so that's my aspiration with our students, is to take those ethical principles and put it in practice through that lens of making sure that you're staying aware of where you're at, your situational understanding, making sure you're staying on top of your profession, and then understanding who as a professional you are, and have as firm an understanding as you can of where you're willing to cash out and walk away because your personal line of integrity can't be violated. So that is kind of what we're doing in HR 4450. I'm interested just to get your perspective in terms of, am I on the right track with this? Do you have other recommendations or things that we may want to consider? As I've got the whole semester to build on this. Like I mentioned, we just laid this foundation of consciousness, competence, and courage last night. And now it threads through all of the case studies and discussions that we have throughout the balance of the semester. So I'll kind of, probably much to your pleasure, shut up for the moment and just open it up and see what feedback, questions you may have for me. Steve?
How has COVID changed the HR environment?
One of the things that, when I first started to develop the curriculum for this course, I was fortunate. I went out and validated it with a lot of my former colleagues who are still in industry. And in fact, I have 2 of them coming to this class over the course of the next 2 weeks to address, Steve, your issue. Is the COVID and the downstream implications of that have completely rocked the foundation of most businesses because they're having to adapt so quickly that now we've gone from adaptation to transformation. So how are some of the things that they're doing going to stick? So everything from, people leaving the workforce, what that's meaning in terms of opening up the labor market. It's been substantive. I mean, I have one individual, they had to hire a full-time person just to administer COVID tracking. And so it's I use in all of my HR classes and some of my OB classes is I literally use kind of the vision of those earth plates. The tectonic shift has really, what we used to believe to be true is no longer necessarily true. And so again, back to that competence thing, that's one of the reasons why I really reinforce that, because what I used to know about HR isn't necessarily valid today. So it's been huge. Great question.
Could I just say first, this is awesome. I got all kinds of cool nuggets I'm gonna take from this, incorporate it into my course or classes at UCCS and my position. And to caveat what you just said, I would emphasize the importance of research. What I have found with some of the younger folks and actually middle generation folks is the confusion that the ability to find information is the same as knowledge.
Yes.
And like you just alluded to, policies change, legal guidance changes, and it's a constant evolution, and it takes discipline to stay in that conversation, whatever the environment that you're operating under. And then my last add would be just the absolute importance of a relationship.
Yes.
And I don't mean just positive relationship building. I mean contextually understanding the organization.
Yes.
I like to say, never take no from a person who's not in a position to say yes. And by understanding the organization that you're in, and when you're dealing with these multifaceted, complex HR scenarios, you really should take it to the balcony and look at it from an unemotional perspective.
Yeah.
And if you have that foundational relationship piece, then you're not looked at as the enemy necessarily the first time you have to go and have that hard conversation.
No question about it. That is such excellent insight, Anthony. One thing I would just build off of that in that competence piece with them is also an area where I really push critical thinking, and specifically that as a practitioner, you can't make decisions based upon the top 5 Google results you do in the search, right? You have a professional obligation to making sure that you're critically evaluating the information that you're using upon which to base decisions. And so I said, watch more than one news channel, look at more than one website, and use a different web browser other than Google and just see what you come up with. And so I say that kind of tongue in cheek, but it's important. I do talk about that in the kind of competence area of how do you critically think and evaluate the information on which you're making decisions. Okay, so Sandra has, oh, hang on, Casey?
I just want to make a comment from my experience in teaching legal environment and business. A lot of students are shocked when they find out that legal is a very low bar compared to ethical.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was a good thing to bring up in some of the case studies, as well as just emphasize that to students that just because it's legal does not at all mean it's ethical.
Exactly right. One of the things I sometimes tell them is you can be 100% right and 0% effective. And so while it may be legally correct, it may not be operationally or ethically correct as well. And so Sandra, Juan, go ahead. I'm sorry, and then I'll get on Sandra's comment.
Yeah, so I just wanted to mention that first of all, I love the whole idea about teaching the students that it's not about being black or white decisions. You know, one of the things that I do in my international business course, and I used to do international marketing as well, is that actually I teach them to think about polarities. You know, polarities helps you take two concepts and basically decide, okay, one may be good at one time and the other one may be good at another time, and actually think in that way.
Yeah.
So think on polarities actually instead of thinking about yes or no. So it's like, okay, look at centralization versus decentralization. Sometimes centralization is good and sometimes decentralization is good, you know? So don't say that one is bad and the other one is bad. You just play with both of them and look at them. And that's how I help with the critical thinking that you just mentioned. I just force them to actually look at both, especially when you're dealing with different cultures.
Right.
You cannot actually look at something under the same prism. You have to use different prisms, like you said, you know, and that's very important.
Yeah, so good. Thank you. I like that. So Sandra asked, so is ethics in HR coming down to it depends, or is there ever a clear line drawn in HR? Where does integrity come in? Integrity in the system process, not offering up for discussion here, just a thought. So, okay, so sorry, I didn't get to the not for discussion, just a thought until the last line, but I'll address kind of your first question. So is there ever a clear line? Let me tell you, when I was a practitioner, there are certain clear, bright lines, and you thank God for the days when those occur, because they unfortunately tend to be the exception more than the rule. And one of the things that I've tried to train the HR professionals that work for me, and I think this goes back a little bit maybe to a comment, Anthony, you made about saying yes and saying no, is that from an HR practitioner standpoint, their first answer should never be no. Because that's oftentimes what people think they're going to get from HR. It should never be no, it should be, let's see if we can find a way to help you meet what you're trying to accomplish, but recognizing we may have some limitations. So are there clear lines? Certainly. Things like HIPAA violations when I was in healthcare, that's a non-negotiable, right? You know, there are certain things from a Sarbanes-Oxley standpoint, some of the other legal constraints that are much more clear cut. But generally speaking, unfortunately, it depends. So.
Yeah. I was just curious because sometimes it just seems that, sure, we have compassion and we know the whole story, but there's a purpose or a reason for that policy.
Right.
There's a purpose for that rule. And if we start, for lack of a better word, muddying in the waters because, well, you know, this family, oh, well, because he's not working full time. Oh, well, it's because, so it just kind of seems like, well, what's the purpose of having that policy if we're not going to have some way to draw that line, that clean line?
Exactly.
But just a thought.
No, I think that's a great point. And that's getting back to that consciousness piece, which is understanding your own bias. And so if I have that compassion, or if I am kind of committed to Mark in his professional development, I also have to be aware of how that's going to impact my decision as well. That, you know, the compassionate decision may not always be the right decision.
Correct.
Right. So.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. I want to be respectful for your time. We've got just a couple minutes. If anybody has any final words of wisdom, thoughts, or questions. Okay. Well, I really appreciate, like I said, without having to provide you guys with any extra credit for attending, like I would with most of my students, I appreciate you taking time out of your snowy day to have a conversation. If you give some thought, have some recommendations in terms of maybe the approach that either I'm taking or how I'm thinking about this for class, please let me know. One, I love the idea of polarities and using that as a teaching tool. But in the meantime, please never hesitate. If you have questions or you have feedback, or there's anything I can certainly ever do for you, by all means, let me know. So it's a privilege to be affiliated with a strong group of professionals like everybody here. So thank you. Tracy, any other final words of wisdom?
Want to thank you very much, Todd. This is an excellent presentation. The recording will be available on our YouTube channel at the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative at UCCS channel, as well as we will be providing a copy of your PowerPoint so that people can access some of this material. So thank you very much. And thank you everybody for attending. Please note that we have a lot of activities coming up. Another roundtable with Sloan Gonzalez as well. So enjoy your snow day, and thank you for joining us.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Be well.
Thank you.